The small town of Willow Creek was known for its peaceful streets and friendly neighbors, but behind the tall iron gates of the old Mason mansion, a dark secret was slowly unfolding. Emily, a sweet, disabled girl with bright, hopeful eyes, had once lived a happy life there. She had lost her mother when she was just a toddler, but her father had always made her feel loved and protected. He had been her hero, the one who taught her to see the beauty in every small thing, despite the struggles she faced every day. But everything changed the day her father remarried. Victoria entered Emily's life like a cold, biting wind. She was tall, elegant, and always perfectly dressed, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. She had only one real interest in life: money. When she married Emily's father, it wasn't out of love, but for the wealth and status his name brought. For a while, Victoria kept up the act of a loving stepmother, but the moment Emily's father passed away unexpectedly, her mask dropped. The once warm and lively mansion became a cold, hostile place for Emily. The cruel reality Victoria saw Emily as a burden, a weak, fragile reminder of a man she never truly loved. She began to treat her stepdaughter like a prisoner, locking her in the basement for hours, sometimes days with little food and no light. The grand halls of the mansion echoed with Emily's quiet, lonely sobs, the sound quickly muffled by the thick velvet curtains Victoria had drawn over every window. Victoria made Emily's life a living nightmare. She blamed the girl for every small inconvenience: a spilled drink, a creaking floorboard, a missing key. Everything became Emily's fault. "You're useless," Victoria would hiss as she threw Emily's meager dinner down the basement stairs. "A burden just like your pathetic father." Emily, despite her fragile body and weak legs, still tried to hold on to the small flicker of hope in her heart. She dreamed of a day when someone might come to save her, or perhaps when her father's spirit would somehow guide her out of this living nightmare. The whispered plan one rainy night Emily, curled up in the corner of the cold, damp basement, overheard Victoria's voice from the floor above. She was on the phone, her sharp, icy tone slicing through the darkness. "It's time to get rid of her for good," Victoria whispered, her voice low but clear. "She's nothing but a burden. Once she's gone, the estate is mine." Emily's heart froze. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her small, trembling frame. She felt the walls close in, the shadows growing darker, more suffocating. She clutched the thin, tattered blanket around her shoulders, her mind racing with fear. The stormy night days passed, each one colder and darker than the last. The rain outside grew heavier, the wind howling through the cracks in the mansion's old stone walls. Then one stormy night, the basement door creaked open, and Victoria's tall, shadowy figure appeared at the top of the stairs. "Get up," she snarled, her voice cutting through the darkness. Emily, her weak legs trembling, struggled to stand, her small frame shivering with fear and exhaustion. She clutched the rusty metal railing as she slowly made her way up the stairs, each step a painful, shaky effort. Victoria grabbed her roughly by the arm, dragging her through the cold, dark hallway, the sound of rain pounding against the windows, echoing around them. Outside, the wind whipped through the tall, ancient trees, their branches clawing at the sky like twisted skeletal fingers. The ground was slick with mud and rainwater, each step sinking Emily deeper into the wet, clinging earth as Victoria dragged her toward the car. The dark drive. The car sped through the narrow, winding roads of Willow Creek, its tires splashing. Through deep puddles, the headlights cutting through the thick, swirling fog. Emily sat in the back, her small hands clutched together, her wide, terrified eyes staring out the rain-streaked window. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears, louder than the storm raging outside. She had no idea where Victoria was taking her, but every fiber of her being told her it was someplace dark, cold, and unforgiving. Finally, the car skidded to a stop at the edge of town, beside an old, rusted bridge that spanned the narrow, rushing creek. The twisted, gnarled trees cast long, shivering shadows across the ground, their wet, dripping branches reaching for the two figures as Victoria dragged Emily from the car. The sewer grate Victoria's sharp heels clacked against the wet, broken stones as she pulled Emily toward a rusted, forgotten sewer grate hidden beneath the shadow of the bridge. The metal bars were slick with rain, their jagged edges twisted and bent like the teeth of a great, hungry beast. Emily's legs gave out, her small frame collapsing onto the wet ground, her terrified eyes locked on the dark, gaping hole before her. She felt the cold, wet earth beneath her palms, the sharp, rusty edges of the grate scraping against her thin, trembling fingers. And then, just as Victoria leaned down, her twisted, rage-filled face inches from Emily's, a deep, commanding voice echoed from the darkness behind them. "Stop right there!" Victoria froze, her hand still gripping Emily's thin, trembling arm. The rain fell harder, each drop splashing against the cold, wet ground, mixing with the deep, echoing growl of the nearby creek. Victoria's grip tightened on Emily's thin arm, her long, painted nails digging into the girl's fragile skin. For a moment, everything was silent, the storm seeming to hold its breath, as the stranger's deep, commanding voice echoed through the darkness. "Stop right there!" Victoria's head snapped around, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the rain-soaked shadows beneath the bridge. She pulled Emily closer, her thin, trembling body leaning heavily against her stepmother's side, her wet, tangled hair clinging to her pale, tear-streaked face. The figure stepped into the weak, flickering light of the old, rusted street lamp above the bridge. He was tall, his broad shoulders hidden beneath a long, dark coat that flapped in the howling wind. His face was shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat, his eyes sharp and unreadable in the flickering light. Victoria's heart raced, her mind spinning. Who was this man? And why had he come here, to this forgotten corner of Willow Creek on such a dark, stormy night? The tense confrontation. "What do you think you're doing?" the man said, his voice cold, his words cutting through the rain, like the crack of a whip. Victoria straightened, her fingers still gripping Emily's arm like the claws of a hawk. She forced a cold, twisted smile onto her painted lips, trying to regain her composure. "Just taking my stepdaughter for a little walk," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, her eyes never leaving the shadowed figure before her. She needed some fresh air. The man took a step closer, his boots crunching against the wet, broken stones of the bridge. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. The terrified, trembling girl, the rusted, gaping sewer grate, the cold, calculating look in Victoria's eyes. "That's quite a place for a walk," he said, his voice growing colder, sharper, each word a blade cutting through the darkness. "Especially in a storm like this." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing for a way out. She forced a cruel, twisted smile, her fingers tightening around Emily's arm. "She's just a bit scared," she said, her voice rising, her eyes flicking nervously toward the sewer grate. "You know how children can be." The man took another step forward, his face still hidden in the shadows, his dark coat billowing around him like the wings of a great, watchful bird. "I don't think this is just about a walk," he said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "Let the girl go." The moment of decision. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the rain freezing in midair, the wind falling silent, the shadows pulling closer around the three figures. Beneath the bridge, Victoria's eyes darted back and forth, her mind racing. She could feel the cold, wet earth beneath her feet, the sharp, jagged edges of the rusted sewer grate pressing against her ankle. She knew that if she ran, this stranger would follow, his long, powerful strides quickly closing the distance between them, and yet, she hesitated. Emily, her small, trembling body shaking with fear, felt the first flicker of hope in her heart. She looked up, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting the shadowed face of the stranger, her thin, cracked lips parting in a silent plea for help. The man stepped closer, his tall, shadowed form towering over Victoria, his eyes cold and unblinking. In the flickering light, "I won't say it again," he growled, his voice low, dangerous. "Let her go." Victoria's breath caught in her throat, her mind spinning, her heart pounding in her chest like the beating of a trapped, desperate bird. And then, slowly, reluctantly, She released Emily's arm, her long painted nails sliding free of the girl's thin, trembling flesh. Emily stumbled back, her weak legs nearly giving out beneath her, her wide, terrified eyes still locked on the shadowed figure before her. The man stepped forward, his coat billowing around him, his tall, broad frame blocking Victoria's path, his dark, unreadable eyes fixed on the trembling, terrified woman before him. The cold wind whipped through the darkness beneath the bridge, the rain falling in thick, icy sheets, each drop echoing against the rusted metal of the old sewer grate. Emily shivered, her thin, trembling body soaked to the bone, her weak legs struggling to keep her upright. The tall stranger stepped between her and Victoria, his broad frame blocking the harsh, flickering light of the street lamp above. For a moment, the world felt smaller, the darkness pulling in tighter around them, the storm's roar muffled by the pounding of Emily's heart. Victoria took a shaky step back, her sharp, painted features twisted with rage and fear. She clenched her fists, her long, manicured nails digging into her palms, her mind racing. She had come so close to ridding herself of the burden that had haunted her every step, the fragile, broken girl who stood between her and the full wealth of her late husband's estate. The stranger's warning. "Stay away from her," the stranger said, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the storm, each word a sharp, deadly blade slicing through the tension in the air. "I won't let you hurt her." Victoria forced a cold, twisted smile, her painted lips parting to reveal sharp, white teeth. She took another step back, her eyes flicking nervously to the gaping black mouth of the sewer behind her, its jagged, rusted bars dripping with rainwater, their sharp, twisted edges reaching for her like the teeth of a hungry beast. "Who are you to interfere?" she spat, her voice rising, her sharp, red-tipped fingers trembling at her sides. "This is none of your business." The stranger stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching against the wet, broken stones of the bridge, his dark, shadowed eyes narrowing beneath the wide brim of his hat. "It became my business the moment you tried to harm an innocent child," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Step back or you'll regret it." Victoria felt a sharp, cold spike of fear drive through her heart, her mind spinning. She had come here to finish what she had started, to rid herself of the girl who had haunted her every step, the fragile, broken child who had become a constant, painful reminder of the man she had married for his wealth, not his love. The painful truth. Emily, her small, trembling frame swaying in the storm, looked up at the stranger, her wide, terrified eyes filling with tears. She didn't know who this man was or why he had come to her aid, but for the first time in years, she felt the faint, flickering warmth of hope in her heart. Victoria's sharp, painted features twisted with rage, her long, red-tipped fingers clenching into tight, trembling fists. She took a step back, her heels sinking into the wet, muddy earth, her sharp, predatory eyes flicking between the tall, shadowed figure before her and the dark, gaping mouth of the sewer behind her. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice shaking, her mind racing. "She's a burden, a weakness. She doesn't belong in my life." The stranger's jaw tightened, his dark, shadowed eyes narrowing beneath the wide brim of his hat. He took another step forward, his tall, broad frame towering over Victoria, his heavy coat billowing around him like the wings of a great, watchful bird. "No one is a burden," he said, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the darkness, each word a sharp, stinging blade. "And no child deserves to be treated like this." Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest like the beating of a trapped, desperate bird. She had to act, had to escape, had to rid herself of the girl who had become the thorn in her side, the fragile, broken child who stood between her and the life of wealth and luxury she had always dreamed of. The desperate escape without another. "Word!" Victoria spun on her heel, her sharp painted nails scraping against the wet, rusted bars of the sewer grate as she stumbled back, her tall, elegant frame slipping into the darkness beneath the bridge. The stranger lunged forward, his hand reaching for her, his dark, shadowed eyes narrowing as she disappeared into the storm, her sharp, bitter laugh echoing through the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent, the rain falling in thick, icy sheets around them, the wind howling through the twisted, gnarled branches above, the darkness closing in like the cold, grasping fingers of the dead. And then, slowly the stranger turned, his tall, broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the wet, broken stones of the bridge, his eyes locking onto Emily's thin, trembling form. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently resting on her small, shaking shoulder, his deep, gravelly voice a warm, comforting whisper in the cold, storm-soaked darkness. "You're safe now," he said, his words a quiet, soothing murmur. "She won't hurt you anymore." The rain continued to pour, each icy drop stinging against Emily's pale, tear-streaked face. She clutched the stranger's coat with her thin, trembling fingers, her small, fragile body shaking with fear and exhaustion. For a moment, the world felt smaller, the darkness beneath the bridge pressing in, the shadows growing thicker, deeper, as if the very night itself were watching them, waiting. The stranger, his broad frame towering over Emily's small, shaking figure, slowly pulled her closer, his rough, calloused hand gently resting on her thin, bony shoulder. "You're safe now," he whispered, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the storm, each word a warm, comforting promise in the cold, rain-soaked darkness. Emily looked up at him, her wide, terrified eyes filled with confusion and fear. She didn't know who this man was or why he had come to her aid, but she felt a strange, comforting warmth in his touch, a flicker of hope in his deep, shadowed eyes. A mysterious savior. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her small, weak voice barely audible over the roaring of the storm, her thin, cracked lips trembling with fear and exhaustion. The stranger paused, his dark, shadowed eyes locking onto hers, his jaw tightening beneath the wide brim of his hat. For a moment he said nothing, his tall, broad frame still as a statue in the flickering light of the old, rusted street lamp above. Finally, he spoke, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, hesitant whisper. "Someone who knows what it's like to be lost," he said, his dark eyes flicking toward the dark, gaping mouth of the sewer grate behind them, its jagged, rusted bars dripping with rainwater, their twisted, broken edges reaching for him like the cold, grasping fingers of the past. Emily's heart tightened, her wide, frightened eyes filling with fresh tears. She didn't understand, but something in the stranger's voice, in the tight, controlled tension in his words, told her that this man had faced darkness of his own, had struggled against the shadows that now threatened to swallow them both. Whispers from the past. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the rain freezing in midair, the shadows pulling in tighter around them, the storm's roar falling to a low, distant whisper. Then slowly the stranger released his gentle grip on Emily's shoulder, his tall, broad frame stepping back, his dark, unreadable eyes flicking toward the rusted, dripping bars of the sewer grate behind them. "Come with me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper, his dark coat billowing around him, like the wings of a great watchful bird. "We can't stay here." Emily hesitated, her small, trembling body swaying in the storm, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the dark, shadowed figure before her. She felt the cold, wet earth beneath her feet, the sharp, jagged edges of the rusted sewer grate pressing against her thin, shaking legs, the darkness behind her whispering her name, calling her back into the shadows. But something in the stranger's deep, gravelly voice, in the tight, protective grip of his calloused hand, gave her the strength to take a shaky, unsteady step forward, her small, fragile frame leaning heavily against his broad, muscular side. The descent into darkness. The stranger led her away from the bridge, his heavy boots crunching against the wet, broken stones of the path, his tall, broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the ground. They moved slowly, each step a painful, trembling effort for Emily, her thin, shaking legs struggling to keep up, her wide, terrified eyes flicking nervously back toward the dark, gaping mouth of the sewer behind them. The storm raged on around them, the wind howling through the twisted, gnarled branches above, the rain falling in thick, icy sheets, each drop stinging against Emily's pale, tear-streaked face. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods, the thick, tangled trees casting long, shivering shadows across the rain-soaked ground, their twisted, skeletal branches reaching for them like the cold, grasping fingers of the dead. The stranger paused, his tall, broad frame still as a statue, his dark, shadowed eyes locking onto the narrow, winding path before them, the thick, choking fog swirling around his heavy leather boots. "We have to move quickly," he whispered, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the darkness, each word a sharp, stinging blade. "Before she comes back." The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the thick, choking fog wrapping itself around the dark, twisted trees like a cold, wet shroud. The narrow, winding path through the woods was slick with mud, the gnarled, skeletal branches above creaking and groaning in the wind, their twisted, grasping fingers reaching for the two figures stumbling through the darkness. The stranger moved quickly, his heavy leather boots crunching against the wet, broken stones beneath his feet, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking nervously between the twisted, towering trees around them, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, shivering shadow across the rain-soaked ground. Emily clung to his side, her small, trembling body shaking with fear and exhaustion, her thin, cracked lips parting in a silent, desperate gasp with every painful, stumbling step. Where are we going?" she whispered, her small, weak voice barely audible over the distant, echoing roar of the storm behind them. The stranger paused, his dark, unreadable eyes locking onto hers, his jaw tightening beneath the wide brim of his hat. For a moment he said nothing, his tall, broad frame still as a statue in the flickering half-light of the storm. "Somewhere safe," he said finally, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, reassuring whisper, his rough, calloused hand gently tightening around Emily's. Thin, trembling fingers, the hidden cabin, they stumbled through the thick, tangled undergrowth, the twisted, thorn-covered branches scratching at their clothes, the wet, muddy earth pulling at their feet like the cold, grasping fingers of the dead. Finally, they broke through the thick wall of trees, their small, trembling figures emerging into a narrow, overgrown clearing, the cold, rain-soaked wind whipping through the long, tangled grass around them. At the far end of the clearing, hidden beneath the thick, twisting branches of a massive ancient oak tree, stood a small, crumbling cabin, its broken, moss-covered roof sagging beneath the weight of the years, its dark, shadowed windows staring out into the fog like the empty, hollow eyes of a long-dead corpse. The stranger led Emily toward the cabin, his heavy boots crunching against the wet, broken stones of the narrow, winding path that cut through the overgrown grass, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, shivering shadow across the rain-soaked ground. A moment of safety. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, its rusted, broken hinges creaking loudly in the darkness, the thick, choking fog swirling around them as they stumbled inside. The cabin's interior was dark and damp, the air thick with the musty, choking smell of mold and decay, the walls lined with thick, twisting vines that clung to the rotting wood like the cold, grasping fingers of the dead. The stranger led Emily to a small, broken wooden chair near the far wall, his rough, calloused hands gently helping her sit down, her small, trembling body collapsing onto the hard, splintered wood, her wide, terrified eyes flicking nervously around the dark, shadowed room. "You'll be safe here," the stranger whispered, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, comforting murmur in the darkness, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking toward the broken, cracked windows above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of the storm, the stranger's pain. For a moment everything was silent, the thick, choking darkness of the cabin pressing in around them, the cold, wet wind whispering through the cracks in the walls, like the quiet, mournful sighs of the dead. Then, slowly, the stranger turned to face Emily, his tall, broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the splintered wooden floor, his deep, shadowed eyes locking onto hers, his jaw tightening beneath the wide brim of his hat. "You're safe now," he said, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, comforting whisper, his rough, calloused hand gently resting on her thin, trembling shoulder. "I promise." Emily looked up at him, her wide, tear-filled eyes filled with confusion and fear. She still didn't know who this man was or why he had risked his life to save her, but something in his deep, gravelly voice, in the tight, protective grip of his rough, calloused hand, gave her the strength to believe him. The small, crumbling cabin creaked and groaned in the cold, rain-soaked darkness, its broken, moss-covered walls trembling beneath the weight of the storm. The air was thick with the musty, choking smell of mold and decay, the shadows clinging to the splintered, rotting wood like the cold, grasping fingers of the dead. Emily sat hunched over in the small, broken wooden chair near the far wall, her thin, trembling body shaking with fear and exhaustion, her wide, terrified eyes flicking nervously around the dark, shadowed room. The stranger moved slowly, his tall, broad frame casting a long, shivering shadow across the splintered wooden floor, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking toward the broken, cracked windows above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of the storm. A faint flicker of hope. He reached into the pocket of his long, rain-soaked coat, his rough, calloused fingers closing around a small, battered matchbox, its damp, worn edges crumbling beneath his touch. With a quick, practiced motion, he struck a match against the rough, splintered wood of the doorframe, the tiny flame flaring to life in the darkness, its warm, flickering light casting long, shivering shadows across the cabin's broken, rotting walls. For a moment, the thick, choking darkness of the cabin seemed to pull back, the warm, golden glow of the tiny flame pushing back the shadows, the cold, wet air filling with the sharp, acrid scent of burning sulfur. The stranger moved, quickly, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking around the cabin as he lit a small, half-melted candle on the narrow, dust-covered shelf beside the door, its weak, flickering flame casting long, twisted shadows across the splintered, rotting floor. The stranger's secret. He turned back to Emily, his tall, broad frame towering over her small, trembling figure, his dark, unreadable eyes locking onto hers, his jaw tightening beneath the wide brim of his hat. "You're safe here," he whispered, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, comforting murmur in the darkness, his rough, calloused hand gently resting on her thin, trembling shoulder. For now, Emily looked up at him, her wide, terrified eyes filling with fresh tears. She still didn't understand why this man had risked his life to save her, why he had dragged her through the cold, wet darkness of the woods to this forgotten, crumbling cabin on the edge of the world. Who are you?" she whispered, her small, weak voice trembling with fear and confusion, her thin, cracked lips parting in a silent, desperate plea for answers. The stranger paused, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking toward the narrow, broken window above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of the dead. For a moment he said nothing, his tall, broad frame still as a statue in the flickering half-light of the storm, his rough, calloused hand tightening around the small, battered matchbox in his pocket. Finally he spoke, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, hesitant whisper, his dark, shadowed eyes locking onto Emily's wide, tear-filled gaze. "I'm someone who's made mistakes," he said, his jaw tightening, his rough, calloused fingers clenching into tight, trembling fists at his sides. "Someone who's trying to make things right." A painful confession. Emily's heart tightened, her wide, frightened eyes filling with confusion and fear. She still didn't understand what this man meant, why his deep, gravelly voice trembled with such pain and regret, why his dark, shadowed eyes seemed to flicker with the faint, flickering light of old, forgotten memories. The stranger turned away, his tall, broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the splintered, rotting floor, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking toward the narrow, broken window above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of the storm. "I made a promise once," he whispered, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, mournful murmur in the darkness, his rough, calloused hand tightening around the small, battered matchbox in his pocket. "A promise I couldn't keep." Emily felt a cold, sharp spike of fear drive through her heart, her small, trembling body shaking with confusion and terror, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on the shadowed figure before her, the flickering half-light of the cabin casting long, twisted shadows across his tall, broad frame. The tiny, flickering flame of the half-melted candle cast long, shivering shadows across the broken, splintered walls of the cabin, the thick, choking darkness pressing in from all sides, the cold, wet wind whispering through the cracks in the rotting wood like the quiet, mournful sighs of the dead. Emily sat hunched over in the small, broken wooden chair near the far wall, her thin, trembling body shaking with fear and exhaustion, her wide, terrified eyes flicking nervously between the tall, shadowed figure before her and the narrow, cracked window above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of the storm. The stranger stood near the door, his tall, broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the splintered wooden floor, his dark, unreadable eyes locked onto the tiny, flickering flame of the candle, his rough, calloused hands clenching into tight, trembling fists at his sides. The unspoken fear. For a moment, everything was silent, the thick, choking darkness of the cabin pressing in around them, the cold, wet wind whispering through the cracks in the walls, the faint, echoing roar of the storm in the distance. Then, slowly the stranger turned, his tall, broad frame blocking the weak, flickering light of the candle, his dark, shadowed eyes locking onto Emily's wide, terrified gaze, his jaw tightening beneath the wide brim of his hat. "I know you're scared," he said, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, comforting murmur in the darkness, his rough, calloused hand gently resting on Emily's thin, trembling shoulder. "But you have to trust me." Emily looked up at him, her wide, tear-filled eyes filled with confusion and fear. She still didn't understand who this man was or why he had risked his life to save her, but something in his deep, gravelly voice, in the tight, protective grip, his rough, calloused hand gave her the strength to believe him. Why are you helping me?" she whispered, her small, weak voice trembling with fear and confusion, her thin, cracked lips parting in a silent, desperate plea for answers. The stranger paused, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking toward the narrow, broken window above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of the dead. The painful confession. For a moment, he said nothing, his tall, broad frame still as a statue in the flickering half-light of the storm, his rough, calloused hand tightening around the small, battered matchbox in his pocket. Finally, he spoke, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, hesitant whisper, his dark, shadowed eyes locking onto Emily's wide, tear-filled gaze. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said, his jaw tightening, his rough, calloused fingers clenching into tight, trembling fists at his sides. "To feel like the world has forgotten you, like no one cares if you live or die." Emily felt her heart tighten, her wide, terrified eyes filling with fresh tears, her small, trembling body shaking with fear and confusion. She still didn't understand what this man meant, why his deep, gravelly voice trembled with such pain and regret, why his dark, shadowed eyes seemed to flicker with the faint, flickering light of old, forgotten memories. The stranger turned away, his tall, broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the splintered, rotting floor, his dark, shadowed eyes flicking toward the narrow, broken window above, the thick, swirling fog pressing against the glass like the cold, wet fingers of storm. The final revelation. "I had a daughter once," he whispered, his deep, gravelly voice a quiet, mournful murmur in the darkness, his rough, calloused hand tightening around the small, battered matchbox in his pocket. "She was about your age, like sweet, kind, full of life." Emily's heart skipped a beat, her wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto the shadowed figure before her, the flickering half-light of the cabin casting long, twisted shadows across his tall, broad frame. "But I lost her," the stranger continued, his voice trembling with pain and regret, his rough, calloused fingers clenching into tight, trembling fists at his sides. "She disappeared, just like you almost did tonight." Emily felt a cold, sharp spike of fear drive through her heart, her small, trembling body shaking with confusion and terror, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on the shadowed figure before her, the flickering half-light of the cabin casting long, twisted shadows across his tall, broad frame.